Order. Question number 3, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change Issues and asks, will he submit an emissions reduction target to the UN by the March 31 deadline? And does he stand by his statement that New Zealand's net emissions are projected to increase 48% in the next decade?
Speaker.
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Climate Change, we will be submitting a target for beyond 2020, well prior to the Paris conference in December, but the member is incorrect in claiming a 31st March deadline. Only 4 of the nearly 200 parties to the Climate Change Convention have so far submitted a target. The 48% increase quoted in net emissions is notional and not real, because it assumes that when forests are harvested, all the CO2 is released as though the wood was immediately burnt. This, as the Minister pointed out at the time, is not a true figure, but an accounting anomaly which we are seeking to change through better rules in the negotiations.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
So then, is he disputing the projections produced by an official report from the Ministry for the Environment that show New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions will increase by 48% over the next decade under current policy settings?
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
And the Minister pointed out that is based on a set of rules that assume that when a tree is cut down, and New Zealand has very large areas of forest that were planted in the early 1990s that are due to be harvested in the next decade, that the moment those trees are cut down, that the CO2 is released into the atmosphere. Now that's a scientific nonsense. That's not what actually happens. And that's why this member, quoting that 48% and implying it results in a big increase in New Zealand's actual emissions, is incorrect.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So does the Minister disagree with the Forest Owner Association President, Paul Nichols, who said last month that the emissions trading scheme had been watered down so much that in each of the last 2 years about 10,000 hectares were deforested as a result of the government's policy settings?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, when this government came to office, it took a very balanced decision that the full cost of the emissions trading scheme on consumers and on business, when the global financial crisis hit, was too large a cost, and so implemented a more moderate emissions trading scheme. I think that was a very sensible response. It actually has New Zealand doing significantly more than most other countries, in that we actually are the only country outside of Europe to have a emissions trading scheme. My view is that our response has been balanced. I note that New Zealand's gross emissions are less than we became to government, and actually increased substantially when the Green Party supported the previous Labor administration.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Does the Minister accept that the weakening of the emissions trading scheme, which the Minister just described, has resulted in reducing the price of carbon pretty close to zero, and that is one of the key reasons why New Zealand's net greenhouse gas emissions have increased by 20% under this government?
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
No, and the member's question shows he doesn't actually understand the emissions trading scheme. You see, the reason the carbon price has been so low is that New Zealand emitters have had access to very cheap international units arising from the global financial crisis. But that was only true until the 1st of January this year. I note the current carbon price is about $4.50, and that for current emissions, they no longer have access to those international units. That actually means the emissions trading scheme has a far higher effective price.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Will the Minister commit to matching the recently announced European climate target of 28 countries, part of the European Union, that they will be reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% below 1990 levels by 2030?
Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, there are a number of significant differences with Europe. The first is that their economies have done very poorly and, unlike New Zealand, are not growing. We actually, on this side of the House, are for growing the economy and for growing jobs. That's not occurring in Europe, and we don't want to match their example. The second is that the population in Europe is in decline, and because New Zealand is now so popular, is doing so well, we actually have population increase and makes us different. The third element that makes us different is that New Zealand has a phenomenally high level of renewables. In fact, it's increased from 65%, Mr Speaker, to 80%, unlike Europe, which is about 15%. And so because we have a far higher proportion of renewables and our biggest portion of emissions is actually from agriculture, we are in a very different position to those European countries. We do intend to pose a target. It will be a responsible target, but one that does not ruin the New Zealand economy.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Does the Minister accept the basic economic logic that a lower price on carbon will result in higher net greenhouse gas emissions, and hence the government's policy of having a lower price on carbon is the reason why our net greenhouse gas emissions have increased so dramatically?
Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Let's get the facts clear. Current emissions, current gross emissions, not including the forestry, have come down by 3% since this party has been in government. Let me compare that with the previous Labor administration when greenhouse gas emissions grew by 8%. So actually emissions have come down. Now the member is absolutely true, and that is the higher the price of carbon, the greater incentive there is to reduce emissions. And there's an honest trade-off to have between the cost of living and the cost of the economy and how much we want to reduce emissions. We're of a view on this side of the House, post the global financial crisis, that we needed to take a cautious view on putting further New Zealanders out of work and putting extra costs on New Zealand households.
Order. Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
So does he accept that the reason the government has struggled so far to come up with an emissions reduction target is because the government spent 6 years implementing policy which has resulted in increased net greenhouse gas emissions of 20% so far and a further 48% under the government's own projections?
Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, we came to government with a commitment that would meet our Kyoto Protocol obligations. This member said we never would. We have, and we've done so. This government set a target of a 5% reduction in emissions by 2020. Advice from the Ministry for the Environment officials is we're on target to achieve that. Now, the member keeps confusing net emissions with gross emissions, with Kyoto rules with the Framework Convention rules to try and paint New Zealand in the worst possible picture. I invite him to actually look at results like the fact that the renewable level of electricity in New Zealand has never been as high for 20 years, with figures last week showing it reached 80%.
Question number 4, Bill Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transport.